Hello and welcome to eSas Charlas, Teatro's very first podcast. My name is Marissa Sandoval and I'll be your host today. First, I would like to thank For Culture and the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture for their support in making this podcast. And today, our guests will be company member Monica Cortés Viharo and resident playwright and dramaturge Julieta Vitullo. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. Props to Marissa for coming up with this idea.
Yeah, thank you, Marissa.
Yeah,
thank you for having us and hosting us in your home.
Yeah. And Kevin, the man, putting the technical pieces together. So yeah, thank you. It's eSas Charlas.
Yes.
eSas because it's the female, and we are an all-female Latina Spanish language company, and charlas means chats.
Yes.
I've noticed that when we do emails, some people say mujeres and some people say hola esas.
Yeah.
So we've been taking advantage of playing with the whole gender of the language for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And especially coming from the Southwest, so just to call out, some of us come from different regions, right? Mm-hmm. So like Julieta from Argentina and Monica and I from the Southwest. And so,
Actually, I'm from California.
Well, California.
Is California considered South?
I thought it was.
Yeah.
And then Tanya is from
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Meg is from New York.
and speaks Spanish fluently.
Yeah, it's funny that our one non-Latina member is someone who speaks and performs in Spanish.
Yeah.
Beautifully, more so than myself. Speaks
Right.
more Spanish than Marissa and myself.
Yeah.
So we're just so fortunate that we have this great diversity
Yeah.
in our group.
Yeah, and we even have a great diversity in terms of how much of Seattle we cover, because we have Tanya in the south, in Tacoma, Marissa, you're here in the Kitsap Peninsula, Monica in the U District, kind of U District area.
North, Seattle.
I'm in Shoreline.
Yeah.
Meg is in West Seattle, so we have a really good,
We cover
broad.
a region, yeah.
Yeah.
We cover a broad region.
And then we have the girl with the accent, yours truly.
Which we're so charmed by.
Yes, definitely. I think what I've really appreciated is that we all come to this from different places and bring different things, yet there are so many commonalities. Like we actually have 3 doctoras in the group, myself, Tanya, and Julieta, so 3 PhDs in the group, but we all come to theater from different backgrounds and different places.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what brought us to ESE and how we all started and where that happened, because, just to call out the obvious about Rose and Meg really being our founders of ESE Teatro since 2010. And I know Rose was sort of the common denominator that brought a lot of us together into the group, and she's no longer with us because she has gone on to do a lot of her own phenomenal work, and we all stayed with ESE and said, what are we going to do with ESE? So maybe we can start there about how we came into ESE and our work there, and maybe some of the projects that we started with ESE. What year?
Yeah, maybe we should go backwards chronology. So Julieta you're, I guess, kind of the newest member?
I think so.
The most recent.
Yeah.
Or, at this table, I guess.
At this
Tanya.
table,
So you're the newest member. So
at this table, I'm the newest. I got on board. I got recruited by Rose in 2017. The first show that I saw was the Construction Zone. It was a series that was done at ACT in partnership with ACT Lab, and ESE was putting, I think it was 4 shows by Latinx playwrights, and the idea was to do these readings. They were more than readings. They were more like somewhere between a workshop and a reading. I think it was just one evening for each of the shows. And then the idea was that from there was going to be a selection of the one show that the audience voted for.
Right.
And I went to see the one that got voted for, like, which I was really glad because I love the show. It was Journey of the Saint by Cesar de Maria, and I didn't get to see the other shows, but that was my first contact with the company. I kind of had heard about it. I had just moved to Seattle from Kitsap. I used to also live on this side. And I went to see the show. I loved what they did. I thought, oh my God, I had started like flirting with the idea of writing theater, and I thought I would love to know more about this company. And I think I introduced myself to Rose right before the show or right after. We talked a little bit, we exchanged contact information, and then at some point, a few months later, I got a phone call or an email from Rose, and I think by the time they were ready, ESE was ready to produce that show, I came on board as an official member, and Rose invited me to be to do dramaturgy for the show, because it's a show by a Peruvian playwright, and there was like a lot of historical contextual background for the actors to understand better. So I did some research, and I got to participate in the rehearsals, and that's how I got to meet. At that time, I guess Marissa, you were on a kind of a sabbatical.
Yeah.
So I got to meet you, Monica, Rose, and Meg, and I'm thinking there was someone else at that time. I think it was Ariel.
Oh, yes, yes.
yeah.
She was
Ariel.
kind of like, it was kind of towards the end of her
Her tenure.
tenure at ESE, and so that was the beginning.
Yeah, so I think when you came on, because Ariel was taking the lead on was it Multicultural Playwrights Festival?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about ESE, besides just putting together our own productions, is partnering with other theaters that have a very specific cultural, ethnic point of view, and doing some collaborative work. So the Multicultural Playwrights Festival that Ariel was in charge of that year, and it's happened several years, was a collaboration between us and Porkfield Productions, a Filipino company, the Hansberry Project,
Yeah.
African American Theater, and
CIS.
CIS, an Asian American theater, and also South Asian Indian. Yes. So it was great to like have you come on board while we were doing all that work, so that you could see sort of like some of the collaborations that we were working on. Definitely, Journey of the Saint was, I think. I think it was definitely one of Rose's favorites, and it was a way for us to work with ACT to put together a production. I think to show them like this is what a fully realized piece would look like. And then Meg, who's not here, is our musical director, as it were, and she did all the music and sound for it. And I thought she did such an amazing job of weaving in the sound for all of that.
It was a beautiful show.
Yeah.
And what about you, Monica? Like when you first started and you first came in, your introduction to ESE.
Right. So I was a professional actor in the San Francisco Bay Area for many years, and decided to get my PhD. So my husband and I moved here to Seattle, and I was like, I'm not going to do any theater while I'm in my PhD program. I'm too busy for that. And then I got a grant, a fellowship from the Mellon Foundation. And my department, the School of Drama at the University of Washington, put it in their newsletter that I got this fellowship and the project I was working on. And Rose read that and said, wait a minute, there's a Latina who is not working with me. So basically what happened was she was putting together Mud by Maria Irene Fornes, and she wanted to do a translation in Spanish, so that on certain nights it would be in English, the original Fornes script, and on certain nights it would be in Spanish, which would be Rose's translation. And she did get permission from Fornes to do this. And they had an actor already on who had signed on to do it, and that actor wasn't able to do it anymore. And so I think Rose is just desperate to find another Latina. She was desperate because she called me and she said, well, would you be interested in reading for the show? And I was like, maybe. And she's like, okay, I'll meet you in 20 minutes. I'm like, what? When? Huh?
That sounds like Rose.
That is Rose. So there's a theater down from the campus that we met at, and I remember it was locked. I had to call somebody I knew who was rehearsing there. I'm like, can you let us in through the back door? And I rehearsed. And here's the thing is, I'm not a native Spanish speaker. So I was, and I guess I didn't even understand that some nights we'd be in English and some nights we'd be in Spanish. So she had me like audition in English, but also audition in Spanish, even though I didn't really know what I was saying. And I was probably mispronouncing it. But I think just the desperation of it all, Rose said, yeah, I think you'd be great. You should do this. And do you want to be stage manager? And I'm like, what? Huh? Where? I ended up saying yes, mostly because, one, you know, as an actor, we're so insecure. We love to be wanted. But the other thing was, one of the big things I had to do for my PhD was I had to prove my sort of Spanish competency, which Julieta later helped me with. That's a whole different story. So I thought, well, if I do this show, maybe perform in English, perform in Spanish, they'll waive that second language competency. And it just ended up being an amazing experience. I remember, Marissa, you showed up, and I didn't even know who you were, and you like brought snacks and you brought us water. I'm like, what? And then Meg showed up and she brought us flowers and like cards. I was like, I don't know who these people are, but they're taking such good care of us.
Yeah.
So I did mud/barro, which is what it's called in Spanish.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing experience. And when it was done, Rose was like, we want you to be part of the company. I'm like, I didn't even know that was an option. So I just started coming to meetings and never left.
Yeah.
So that's basically my story.
I like what you were saying about, feeling that you were being cared for, and people bringing different things and snacks and flowers. It reminded me of when we did Journey of the Saint, and Meg's mom brought flowers for Rose, who was the director, Meg, who was doing musical direction, and I was doing the dramaturgy. And I was relatively new very new to Seattle theater, and that was, to me, that moment. We had a beautiful picture of the three of us on opening night, and that for me was feeling this sense of belonging.
Right.
Yes.
Community.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, and for for somebody who doesn't come from an artistic background like you all, that I would say I've always had an interest in theater and things like that, just because my tia, who has been such a great influence through the years, she writes poetry, and she has introduced me to theater, and so those are some of the things why I always love theater so much. But going back to that, it reminds me of when I first came and was introduced into the group. So it was Bernie's apartment that Rose did in 2000. I think it was 2017, and I went to the show and I saw it, and there was some parts that really resonated with me in that. And so I remember, the connection is I worked at Harborview Medical Center. I've always worked in healthcare. Rose is working at Harborview, and I would see her flyers all throughout campus, and so I thought, well, here's theater, let me go check it out. And Latina theater, like, my goodness, I'm from the Southwest, and so I thought, wow, there's Latina theater out here. And I went to one show, and it, like I mentioned, it really resonated with me. So after that show, I emailed Rose, and because you could easily get work email, and I told her how there were pieces in that show that I identified so much with. Like there was, so I was a teen mother myself, and then also coming up in a Latina background where you have very strong women who take the reins a lot, and so those were some of the characters in that play.
I was Garcia Lorca's
Yeah, I was about to say, I love that a modern translation of a Spanish Golden Age play connected with you and your very contemporary background.
Yeah. And so I emailed her sharing that, and she said, let's go for coffee. So I was like, okay. And then after that, it was sort of like, I remember at one point she would just invite me, right? And then take me to some shows. Sometimes you get free tickets, and I loved it. And she said, because there was a period where I felt like, where do I fit into the group? I'm not an actor. I don't have desire. I love watching, right? I love reading, all of that, but and I don't have any background in theater like all of you, intellectual ladies. And so she said, I think that your organizational background skills can really help us. And so I said, okay, where? And so that's how I sort of started doing admin for Ese Teatro. And then that's where I started some work with our first show, Barro, where I met Monica, and that was lots of fun. Good history there, that show. And what I want to just mention, I was so impressed that, because I do remember Rose had a hard time finding an actress for that part, Maya, and it was like, oh my God. And she said, well, would you ever consider? I was like, no way. She goes, well, why don't you just read? I could read in Spanish. I could read and write in Spanish.
This is how desperate Rose was.
Right.
She's like, everybody she met.
She's like, okay, then read this script. So I read it, and I said, she goes, you read very well in Spanish. I said, yeah, but I don't want to do this. But, and so she, but it was just great to then, when she found you, we thought, oh my gosh, like this is, wow, where are we ever going to find this? Like, get her while we can, And what I was so impressed with through that whole production is that you, and maybe of course it's like, growing up in the region, and you're very, you have the ear for the language, even though maybe you aren't fluent, right? But how well you did doing that in English and Spanish, learning to do the play. Who else can do a play in English and another language, the whole play?
Well, I have to say it helped that my character was supposed to be illiterate, so I figured if she makes mistakes in her grammar. Also, I think what really helped is that I'm the kind of actor that creates a lot of backstory, and one of the backstories, and Julieta and I talked about this, is that this character, my father is originally from Mexico, and one of the things I learned, growing up in the U.S., you think everyone in Mexico speaks Spanish. No, there are people who, for them, Spanish is a second language. They speak Mixtec, or they speak Nahuatl. They speak an indigenous language, and so we talked about. And Rose being from Peru, there are a lot of indigenous peoples in Peru. So the idea that this character may be indigenous, and their first language is an indigenous language, and their second language is Spanish, and that they are not formally educated, so their grammar and their vocabulary may be all over the place. So I just took that as my backstory and said, this is what will allow me to do this without fear, because I was filled with fear doing the show when we first started, and I realized at some point I just have to be okay.
Yeah, and for the first few years that I had been in Ese, I kept hearing about how Monica learned all the lines in this play in such a short amount of time. I had never spoken Spanish to Monica before, except for a few words here and there, right?
Spanglish.
And of course I get, she has the pronunciation, but I never actually had a conversation. And then all of a sudden, during the pandemic, we did this Zoom production for Casa Latina women who attended virtually, and I finally got to hear, it wasn't the whole play, but it was a couple of scenes, and I finally got to see Monica's performance of this character, and I was blown away. And it was also I had worked with Monica already, by then I guess one show, right? Two bags. But I had never seen her perform in Spanish, so it was this whole new side of Monica opened up to me. It was incredible.
Julieta was my Spanish tutor to get me through my grad program, and it was just so great to. I think that's the other reason that I have stuck with Ese, is that it has opened up a side of my identity that I think a lot of Latinas, and I think you totally can relate to this, don't get to explore. Is okay, you're Latina, but you grew up in the U.S., you don't grow up speaking Spanish and watching Cantinflas. You grow up watching, the Jeffersons.
Right.
And
You're like novelas, but Golden Girls also.
Yeah. And you know, you love Taco Bell. You're ashamed to admit it, but you love some Taco Bell. And so to work on Spanish language stuff, and it's almost like addressing a trauma of the loss of your culture.
Yes.
Because, you know, one of the reasons I don't speak Spanish is because my father came to the U.S. at the age of 16, undocumented, and he decided no Spanish in the house.
Yes.
Because he wanted to speak English really well. And also he said to me, I don't want my kids to have Spanish accents, because I remember him saying this, no matter how many years I live in this country, and eventually he became a citizen, because I have an accent, I'm always considered a foreigner.
Yeah.
And so the loss of a whole side of my language and my culture,
Yes.
I just like, okay, well, whatever. But to be able to explore that is such a luxury. And to be able to explore that with other women, to be able to explore that in an artistic venue, and also the emotional feelings behind that. One of my favorite memories when we worked on Mud was Mud/Barro was we did these performances for different communities. Like we went to a men's shelter.
Yeah.
We went to the Chief Seattle Club, and we did one at, I think it was Casa Latina, with women, many of whom are migrant women who are on their own journey of learning English. And I remember one of the women, and it's funny because we had a reporter there, so we actually have an article about this. One of the women says, I connect with Maya because my father didn't want me to be educated in my own country, so I already struggled in my own country, and now I'm here and I'm trying to learn English. I barely understood what she said, but I knew it, and I just burst into tears, and I told her, kind of in my broken Spanish English, that's how I feel about Maya, is that my struggle to learn the Spanish, for me, paralleled Maya's struggle to be literate.
Yes.
And this woman and I were both crying kind of for the same reason. Like, she was having trouble learning English, and I was having trouble learning Spanish, and it's supposed to be my native language.
Yes, yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like being able to be part of a group where you're not just exploring culture, but you're exploring language, it's a side of our identity.
Yeah. That's lost.
That's lost. Yeah. You're not a native speaker either, so you know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and even neither are my parents, and it was my grandparents that Spanish was their first language, and they were very, like your father was adamant about, we don't speak, they only spoke Spanish to each other when they didn't want anybody to understand what they were saying, and they wanted the kids to assimilate very much so. And so, you know, growing up at home, it was Spanglish that we spoke certain things. And if there were, depending on who was around, we didn't speak Spanglish, right? You spoke complete English. And so, but, you know, growing up in a very Chicano, Latino neighborhood where that was very common, like my identity was everybody else's, right? It was very common. It wasn't until I moved out here to the Northwest that I was like, wow, I was like, I'm in a melting pot, you know?
Well, it goes to show how powerful language is. Because when we think about our backgrounds, I come from the other side of the continent, like all the way in the south. You can't go any further.
Yeah.
And what unites us, really, it's this language that we all relate to so differently. Like you're talking about, like the trauma and like the difficulty of not having had that luxury of being exposed to the language in the way that in your own terms you would have done it differently, and yet here we are because we still have that whatever is left, which is a lot, from that language, which in the end is, you know, because of colonialism, right? Because of Spanish colonialism. And we all have this commonality. And the really amazing thing about Latin America, which I think is interesting maybe for our audiences, and I think, you know, when I think about US Americans and like the sense of identity, the many identities here, right? I think there's this huge geographic and cultural region called Latin America, where we have this common language, we have these indigenous cultures that we are all a part of, because we all have some indigenous blood, you know, depending on the country, more or less, depending on the individual family history and like where our ancestors came from and so on and so forth. But for me, I never consider myself Latina until well into being here in this country. I've been here for 21 years, and I remember the first few years when people used the term, well, at that time people still use Hispanic more, which I didn't like.
Yeah.
And then they started using Latina, Latino, and then more recently Latinx, you know, to indicate like it could be either gender. And I had a hard time relating, because I thought, no, I'm not Latina, because I didn't grow up in the US. I'm Latin American. And then over time, and it was almost like a sense of pride. Like, no, I'm not, but not because I didn't want to be Latina, but because I wanted to be Latin American. I wanted so bad to be Latin American, because I felt once I left my country, I'm not just Argentine. I'm Latin American. I'm part of a bigger thing.
Right.
And then eventually, and I think that ese, actually, I don't think I shared this with you guys before. I think that it was ese what finally made me realize, yes, I am Latina, because there's a lot of different ways
to be Latina.
So now it's like this sense of belonging to this group, where like we still have this common, this really, really strong common background, even though we all come from
different
backgrounds.
And that's really important to talk about, you know, the language. It's funny because I said this, someone said to me something, we're all, you can't see us, but we're all kind of fairer skinned Latinas. Someone said to me, well, if only you had a European last name, you could pass. I'm like, Cortés is European. Right, it's Spanish. Spanish is European. And it's funny for people to like make that connection, that like what we share as Latinas is indigeneity and colonialism.
Yes.
And people not realizing that actually Spanish is a colonial language.
Right.
If we wanted to go all the way back, we'd be speaking some indigenous language.
Right. It's not native. Yeah. It's European.
Yeah. So, but I agree with you. This idea of like finding a community where I actually do have. It's funny that you say that about not feeling Latina until you came to the U.S. I remember I have some friends from Nigeria who said, I wasn't African until I came to this country, right? Like they were like always Nigerian, right? But then you come here, and if you are part of an identity that's that there's not a lot of you find your common peoples, and so I think that's
I think that's one of the beautiful things about migration, which there's so much hardship and there's so much that you're leaving behind, and I'm always talking about this. Is like one of the topics of the day also for me, is like this idea that like my heart is broken and it's never gonna be fixed because I left home and now this is my home, and yet I don't fully fit in, and people sometimes still, Monica and I were talking on the ferry on the way here, like they do the double take when they hear me, and like this, a lot of people experience this in many different ways, whether because of the way they sound or the way they look, and it's sometimes you just want to blend in, right? And then the idea that when I go back home, like home, my original home, I also don't fit in because I've been living in the US for 21 years. But there's something really beautiful about this like movement across.
It's the diaspora.
Which is that, but there's that sense of belonging when you find someone who is your own.
You can plug into that diaspora across continents, and I think that's why I've really appreciated, one story that I always think about, if I could summarize essay in one story. So when I was working on Barro/Mud, we had to think about words. And the thing is, the Spanish language can have many words for the same thing. So the word pig came up a lot in the script. And so there's me, my father is from Mexico, but I'm raised in the US. My native language is English. One of the actors originally was from the Dominican Republic. One of the actors' family is from Nicaragua. Rose's family is originally from Peru. So we came up with so many words for pig. Chancho, cochino, puerco, cerdo. Like how many, like, and they all kind of have different connotations. So we had to kind of settle on one word that we felt was most universal, but it just reminded us of the connection we have, but also the difference that exists among the different Latino cultures, and it was actually really beautiful to think like, okay, we could come up with so many words because we're all coming from different places.
Yeah.
And somehow those words will be understood.
Yeah.
Like even if you never use that word, the context would allow you to, still connect. And sometimes people ask, oh, like you speak another language, like you speak a different Spanish, right, in Argentina. I'm like, no, it's the same Spanish. It's just a variation.
Yeah. It's a variation.
But it's different. Yeah, it's different, but we still communicate with each other perfectly. Yeah. I would never have an issue talking to someone from Colombia or Mexico or Cuba. Of course, there's like some slang that can be a little bit hard to grasp. But we all can communicate.
One of my students, she is from West Seattle. Her parents are from Mexico, undocumented, and she just did a summer in Spain, and she said she was the most independent of all the students because she could navigate. Yes, they could tell she wasn't speaking Spanish as the Spaniards do.
Right.
She wasn't using her vosotros necessarily.
España.
But she could totally navigate in a way that the other students couldn't.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about our collective or our collaborative? So, part of eSas history is, as we know, Rose and Meg have been our founders, and until recently, Rose stepped away. Meg is thankfully still with us, and so I think in the community, especially the theater community, Rose has made a name for herself, and she was, took the helm of eSas for a period of time, and then as she sort of started fading out and wanting to kind of do her own thing and work independently, we all decided to stay with the group and sort of reimagine ourselves. And so let's talk a little bit about that, our collective, our collaboration, and how that came to be, and maybe how we make our decisions and do our work.
I really appreciate that so much of what we do now is just happened naturally. So I think we all looked to Meg and to Rose as sort of the leaders. That was a natural hierarchy. But when Rose decided to step away, I think it just naturally started where we would just ask each other, well, what do you think? What do you think? And so our decision-making process has become extremely collaborative. And as an academic, dare I say, feminist, in the sense that we're not very hierarchical. We very much check in with each other about how we're feeling, and we very much take on the roles that we feel comfortable doing. And I just so appreciate that, because I don't feel like there's a hierarchy. What I really appreciate is that there is just as much value around playwriting, which Julieta does, as there is around the administrative piece, which is what Marissa does. Like, we would not be here if Marissa wasn't helping us apply for grants.
Right.
And that you are just as much of a star as our resident playwright, or anyone else, or our resident musical director. That we're all valuing the contributions that we make, because we wouldn't be here without each of those individual contributions.
And I think that part of how we came to having this model, which I think is pretty unusual, there's usually, most companies have an artistic director, and that was the model that eSas fell into for a long time. And it's not like better or worse, it's a very different way of working together. And I think it's a combination of how we came to the group and then our personalities. I think it has to do with the fact that we each came, we were basically recruited, because of our different interests and talents, and then over time, as things developed, Rose was starting to step to the side a little bit. There was a period of time where she was still with us, and we were exploring this decision-making model. Like there was like a year of transition, I think, right before the pandemic, where we were starting to talk about what would it look like if we made decisions that way. And then I think so because of the way we came on board, like with this idea that we could each offer something. So we each have these things that we're interested in, and this is how we kept talking about how are you going to grow within ESE. I remember that being a conversation that we had in one of our retreats. I think it was in 2019 or something like that. I think it was March of 2019, and we kept asking the question: how are you going to grow? How is this going to serve you? Because it's not just about, of course, what we're bringing to the company, but how we can grow as individuals. And so it had to do with that. It had to do with our personalities. I definitely agree with Monica. I think there's something definitely very feminine in the way that we do the work, because there's like, it's very horizontal and it's very caring. Like we're always like caring for each other, which is like
definitely the relationship is more important than the art, actually, than the production, than anything. Like it's all about the relationship, and if we are not in a community of care, then we don't seem to none of us seem to want to be in anything other than a community of care.
And it's interesting because I think that shows in the work, and it's, I think, not for nothing we're doing theater together, right? Because in theater, when you put together a play and it's a collaborative process, you don't start by talking about, oh, this is the message that the play is going to convey, and this is what we want the audience to get these, We work with the actors on, the actors work on their characters and exploring who they are, and by doing that deep work of relating to each other, then there's a piece of art that is going to reach the audience. So I think that there's like a parallel between the work of the theater work, the work in the rehearsal, and how you're putting together a play from beginning, rehearsal until you actually put it on its feet, with the work that we do as a company, where we're prioritizing the relationships, prioritizing like each of us and what we need and what we want and like where we want to get.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about there's a theater practitioner and academic. Her name is Jan Cohen-Cruz, and she talks a lot about community-based theater, how you work, and one of the things she talks about is like process is just as important as product, maybe sometimes even more. So she makes this argument that like if you had a horrible process but your show was on Broadway and made money, nobody cares. Like, okay, it made money. But if you're working with a community organization and you had a horrible process and a great show, that's not a success. You need to have a good process and a good show, right? And so I do feel like that's been our game plan from the beginning. Like we all need to feel taken care of. I mean, that's the whole thing behind the question about not just what do you bring to ESE, but what does ESE bring to you?
Yeah.
What are you going to get from it? And I appreciate that because I agree with you that it shows in the work that we're doing something we love, we're doing it with people we love, and that love is infused with everything that we're doing, and that when we come together, we're not predetermining a message. We're discovering the message as we work together. That it's group discovery, and I've really appreciated that model of working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about our future project, Two Big Black Bags, that we're currently in the process.
September 2023.
Yes.
It'll be our first truly post-pandemic main stage. I mean, Fermin was...
Well, maybe we can back
sort of
up a little bit.
Mid-pandemic.
Yeah, well, it was towards the end when things were starting to open up, so it was November of 2021.
Yeah.
It was one of the first shows, done by small companies with a lot of caution and not even sure if the show was going to happen.
Yeah.
It actually did, because it was, October, November of 2021.
There weren't a lot of
Minimal
companies
audience.
that were going that were doing anything in person yet.
Yeah.
And we wanted really so much. We missed theater in person. We wanted so much to make it happen.
Yeah, and we did.
Yeah.
And we did. But you're right, Monica. This is going to be the first truly post-pandemic show.
Well, maybe like post like vaccine or whatever, because for that show it was like we had to make sure we had fewer members in the audience, and there were just a lot more
Abide by
precautions.
COVID guidelines and make
yeah.
sure that people coming into the show can prove they had vaccination. I mean, there were
a negative COVID test. Yeah.
There were a lot of hoops that we and let's just call it out. I mean, it was very difficult during some periods where we felt like, is this going to happen?
Oh, even talking about rehearsing together, like can we rehearse together with or without masks?
Right.
And how many people can be there, and is there enough air circulation? So this
Really felt at that time that for a small company there were just so many obstacles to actually being able to make it happen. Like some companies had the COVID officer. Like a company like ours would never be able to even afford having those kinds of things in place. So it was very challenging, but we were able to pull it off, and we actually had an amazing response. People came to see the show, and families came to see the show. A lot of kids, because it was a show for all ages, and it was a beautiful experience, but it was very difficult getting there. Like, talk about the process, right? I think that we still
hard process.
I think it was a really hard process, in part because of the whole, the fact that we're coming out of the pandemic. And going back in person, but I think it shows still in the performance that the relationships were being put in the forefront. That we were still prioritizing that.
Absolutely. I was going through a lot of personal stuff with my family. Unfortunately, I lost both my parents this year, and yet I remember thinking, there's no way I can walk away from the show. Like, there's just too many people invested in it. I just, this is a commitment, not just to a show, but to people I love. I also want to point out that I'm hearing the pups snore, and it's the most lovely. It's just the loveliest thing to hear. Is to hear Marissa's dog snore. And what I also liked about Fermin is that it pushed us to do something different, which is the music video.
Right.
So if anyone goes to our website, esateatro.org, you can see the music video. I think that's a piece that wouldn't have happened if we weren't forced to think outside of the box.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we didn't know at any point this can be shut down. And I remember in some of our pre-planning stages, we thought, okay, it was like, walking on something that was unstable, and
eggshells,
and we said, okay, we need to be able to pivot as quickly as possible, and if something gets shut down, like, what are we going to pivot to, and how are we going to produce something?
So we ended up with this video. We ended up doing both. Fortunately, we were able to still do the performance, but we had the video as kind of like, okay, this is our plan B. If this is all we can get to the world out of this play, this is gonna be it. But now we have the video, which was our first ever music video, right? And I hope that there will be more.
And I'd like to think that music video is the sort of ancestral, the ancestor of this podcast. Like, I don't know if we would have ever thought of a podcast before. So, that's the nice thing about, they say necessity is the mother of invention. So it's pushed us in some different directions, definitely.
Well, tell us a little bit, before we move on to the next, but tell us a little bit about Fermin for those that didn't get to watch the play.
Yes, so the full name of the play is Fermin's Great Book of Dreams, and it's a play for all ages, inspired by some songs that I used to listen to when I was a kid, growing up in Argentina, by this singer-songwriter. Her name was Maria Elena Walsh. And any kid of my generation, and even to this day, who grew up in Argentina would know these songs, and they're very imaginative, and they usually have these animals that come to life as talking beings, and there's inanimate objects that also come to life, and it's really sweet and also highly, it's, you know, it has like these two sides of being very playful and also very intellectual. And so I grew up with these songs, and so that's kind of the part of the inspiration was that, and then the other big source of inspiration was the story of the Tooth Fairy and Raton Perez, which is the kind of like the equivalent of the Tooth Fairy in the Latin American world. So, you know, it's about a kid who's struggling with growing up and having experienced the loss of his grandmother, and goes on this huge adventure that involves Raton Perez and the Tooth Fairy, because it turns out that they both show up because this kid is bicultural and bilingual. And so it was a little bit inspired also by my own son, who's now like almost a teenager, but at the time when I started writing the play, he was starting to ask, or like starting to figure out that there wasn't such thing. I'm sorry, spoiler, but for our listeners, there's no such thing.
Still Santa.
But I mean, there is, right? Because there is, and that's kind of what the play is about. That there is still that magical world on the other side of like beyond the edge of the bed, right? Of the kids. So. So that's what the story is about, and you know, it has music, and it has like this sweet potato queen, and this seagull who is a little bit lethargic, and you know, has all these quirky, funny, loving, very loving characters.
My favorite memory from the show was, and I had the honor of playing the Tooth Fairy. That on our program we had the words to some of the songs, and there were some kids that joined who knew some of the songs. Yeah. And they sang along.
They all sat in the front row, and they
shared the lyrics with like people who didn't know the songs. Yeah. And so that was really wonderful to hear. Just to hear kids sing along with the songs, and people who didn't know the songs sing along with the songs.
Right. Yeah, it was a great experience, and it was just good to see families come out, and they really wanted to see theater at that point come out together.
And we had one special performance for a school that resides in U Heights. So U Heights it's an amazing location. It's actually an over 100-year-old schoolhouse on University Ave that, instead of getting demolished like everything else, was turned into a community center. And there's all these resident community groups there, and one was a school for autistic children, and they and so the place where we performed was basically the theater for that school when it was a schoolhouse. And they came, and it was great just to see the different ways that they were connecting with the story, with the music, with the interactive nature of the characters kind of walking through the audience. It was really amazing to see kids and parents at very different levels connecting with the material.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that, because we were talking about the video before, the music was written by my sister. And I had never written a song, and my sister, who is back in Argentina, her name is Matilde, is a musician, and we had done a couple of collaborations. She composed the music for Chubby Black Bags. She did music for a couple of other shows before, but this is the first time we wrote a song. I had never written a song before, so this was like as a result of not knowing what was going to happen because of the pandemic and whether we were going to have to shut down. And I, personally, going back to that personal growth, I am so thankful that eSas allowed me to take that risk and write that song.
So now you can add songwriter to your CV.
Yes, playwright / songwriter.
Academic, songwriter, all of it. Yeah, no, it was definitely a great experience.
Yeah. So what about our next production, Two Big Black Bags?
Well, may I hand the baton to Monica, since Monica was in the workshop, because I don't want to feel like, it's another play that we're producing, because as resident playwright, I'm so fortunate that I get to put some of my work But Monica was in it too, so maybe like I'm happy to talk about it. But do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no. What I love about it is it's a story of of a veteran of the Falkland Islands War. At least that's how it's known to us here in the U.S. And in the U.S., it's like a little blip, you know.
Yeah.
I actually have this very clear memory of being in elementary school, and we were playing kickball, and there was a student, his parents were South Asian, I think from India, and I remember him saying, "I'm gonna kick this ball the way England is gonna kick the ass of the Falkland Islands," or something like ridiculous like that. Yeah. Because for us it was like, oh, it's this short little war, and you know, it's kind of a fait accompli, who's gonna win it, blah blah blah. But then, as a Latina, to learn really the history of like how pivotal this war is in the story of Argentina and the story of the Argentine people, again, very much a vestige of colonialism, a vestige of very much the totalitarian regimes that exist in Latin America. Yeah, it was. I was so impressed by how much I learned from just reading the script and learning about the Malvinas, these islands, and the way in which the Argentine people feel about these islands, and how the war to preserve these islands, how that gets kind of twisted and changed and used to to get people to do certain things based on patriotism. So I just felt like I just learned a lot from the process, and the trauma, the PTSD that so many veterans go through is the universal story that we're talking about in this play.
Yeah, and the hope was to be able to connect that, right? So that the audience would be able to connect that with that story that could be, in this particular place, the Malvinas, but it could be really anywhere.
Vietnam, Korea,
any war.
Yeah.
And to be able to experience that, and to me, one of the greatest compliments, we after I think it was after the first night, we did a three night run. It was a short run because it was a workshop production that we did with Teatro and Parley. There were two producing companies also presenting with Act Lab, because they were giving us the space and the infrastructure. And a woman came to me and said she was a therapist or a psychologist, and that she was so impressed with how the journey of the character from his trauma to his healing had hit so many of the marks of what she saw in her with her own clients. And I was like, oh really? Because I actually don't know much about it, because I didn't write it thinking about that. I wrote a story of this character that just kind of came to me, and that I pieced together based on actual ex-combatants that I'll tell you in a second why we say ex-combatants for this particular war and not veterans, which of course we can use both, but there's an interesting peculiarity. But I pieced it together based on these people that I met, and a lot of fiction and non-fiction that I read, and all of my knowledge of the topic over the years, because I did a documentary film about it, I wrote a book about it. I thought I was done with the topic, and then I realized I had a play in me as well. But I had never thought about it from the point of view of the psychology of the war veteran, and yet it came through, which I was really glad that the audience was able to connect with the experience. And then of course you hear it, right? You hear it in the audience when people are laughing and people are crying and people are kind of having these reactions, which is really kind of what tells you, once you're in that room, which is why it's so important to be able to go back to in person, right? To do live theater, and why theater is such a unique experience. So we talk about ex-combatants because they because of the nature of they were drafted.
Oh, conscripted.
Yeah, they were conscripted soldiers. They were very young. They were 18 or 19 when they were taken by force to fight this war. And the X is like the fact that they don't combat anymore. So it's kind of like politically, the activism that took place after the war. There was a conscientious decision by groups of ex-combatants,
right?
Veterans of the Malvinas War, to call themselves that, to emphasize the fact that they're no longer fighting. They never actually chose to fight, because most of them were conscripted soldiers. They weren't professional soldiers, so they didn't choose to go there.
And once again, the power of language, right? I mean, even Malvinas, I knew it as the Falkland Islands, the Falkland Wars.
Right.
Okay, very anglicized name, but for a lot of Latin Americans, it's the Malvinas. And to learn that, just brings a different dimension to it. Also, the main character deals with this issue that I think is very universal for a lot of Latinos. Especially like your fairer skin, there's the whole colorism issues about quote unquote passing, right?
Yes.
And the way in which that you can avoid certain things if you can pass. Also the multicultural nature of Latin America, that we are many, many things, that we are Native, we are European, we are, just so many different identities. And I think as I'm always reminding my husband, we are a rainbow people.
Yeah. And that was one of the things I don't recall if it's like in our mission or like just sort of like the description about us, our website that Rose had mentioned is like, we are the color of brown.
The many shades.
The many shades, the rainbow.
The rainbow of brown.
Yes. Right? Like we can be blonde hair, blue-eyed, and we could be Afro, Latino, you know, so.
Yeah. So that's why I really appreciated the play, because I think the play, hits the notes that you want to hit with good art, where it connects with people on an emotional level. There's something universal. But it does shed a light on a historical moment that I think from the American vantage point is not clear that there is this Latino dimension.
Right.
And so I really appreciated that play. And I'm so excited. So we went from doing basically a staged reading kind of with we had some props, we had some live music, etc., to doing a full-fledged production for September of 2023. Yeah. Very exciting.
So we're in pre-production right now, looking at venues, starting to reach out to some people to collaborate with, and we're super excited.
Yeah, very excited about this next project.
Yeah.
Okay, mujeres, well, I think we covered a lot, and I really thank you both for being here and your willingness to take on this project. And it's just exciting to have these conversations and discussions about all of our work and our history and our backgrounds. And so I just want to thank you both.
Well, thank you for coming up with this idea, for spearheading. We really appreciate it.
You know, I hope that there's many more, and I know that our listeners are going to be excited to get the next installment.
Yeah.
And perhaps even let us know, reach out if you have a topic that you're interested in, that you would like us to cover, or like, maybe I shouldn't say us, but Marissa, who is our host, and any guests that you have in mind. And it doesn't always have to be in person, so if you have someone in another part of the world, I'm sure that can be worked out too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.